So our third and final presentation for this afternoon will be, it's a text in theosophical literature that serves as a manual for sincere students of theosophy, for sincere students everywhere, which could be said to outline the discipline that is needed to embark on the journey that Jean was just talking about. The light on the path. Shobha is our presenter for the light on the path.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jerry and Eugene. It's very interesting that everything that has been said, all these two talks, are really, I'm going to be repeating in a different way. So welcome friends from all over the world. All our devotional books that we read, contemplate, absorb, and practice is about theosophy in so many different ways. Whether we look at the voice of the silence, whether we look at the light on the path, which I'm going to be talking about, whether we look at the Dhammapada, we look at the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or the voice of the silence, we need to spend a lot of time trying to understand these gems. MC, or Mabel Collins, was a student of the Theosophical movement in the 19th century and was familiar with H.P. Blavatsky's works. And she was in the Theosophical movement, and she saw that H.P. Blavatsky was talking about the treasures in Eastern wisdom and used a lot of Sanskrit, Pali, and Tibetan words. So she felt it was necessary to say the same thing, but using English mainly for the Western audience. And at that time in the 19th century, it was spiritualism was extremely popular, and spiritualism, as under quotes, was actually communicating with the dead. So MC wanted to make sure that she talked about a higher form of spiritualism. And she couched profound metaphysics in the English language to reach the West. And to anybody who showed interest in the supernatural world. One of her main mantra, I'm using a Sanskrit word here, was that she wanted people to be serious about the path. And she wanted the neophyte, she called the person the neophyte, or what we would call the eternal pilgrim. We know that she wrote a lot of different books, but the two books that we use in Theosophy are Light on the Path and Through the Gates of Gold. Today, we shall try to look at the architectonics or the structure of the book, as well as something that is infused into the book, which is also there in many of our devotional books. I will just call it the X factor. Now, when we talk about the structure, we see that the book is divided into several sections. The first part, or more accurately, the second paragraph, hits us with 4 sentences that will be delved into detail a little later, because we need it. She devotes about more than 50 pages on that. First, however, we see 3 sets of numbered statements, followed by a 4th statement that seems kind of contradictory. And then she expands on it. So this goes on through section 1 and 2. And then she has a section for the footnotes from these 2 sections. But actually, she also says later that this is a prelude to the several pages, that 50 or more pages, that are going to be devoted to the 4 sentences we will mention later. Then finally, there is a tiny section where she, for the first time, elaborates on the one Sanskrit word karma. She entitles it karma, and she talks a little bit about what karma is. Now, let's look at the X factor. When I was in school, I studied about scalars, vectors, and tensors. The teacher probably was brilliant in the field, but was not very good at communicating to our students who were already struggling with calculus. Today, information is at my fingertips, and I feel like going back to school to study these three quantities. A scalar is a number that has magnitude, and an example would be temperature or mass. One may call it unidimensional. Then follows a vector. A vector, on the other hand, has magnitude and direction. For example, examples would be velocity and acceleration, because it's so important to know in which direction it's going: northeast, northwest, southwest, etc. The computation is a little more complex when we come to vectors. But the one that really stumped me was the tensors, which have determinants that you need to use. And these can be three or multidimensional. And an example is stress factors. The applications of scalars, vectors, and tensors in mathematics is in applied physics and in data analysis. So why am I talking about that when I'm talking about the light on the path? HBB says in many of her writings that mathematics is an exact science, and therefore I feel it is analogous to the study of philosophy, occultism / theosophy. MC talks about the neophyte entering this path, this beautiful path. And he needs intensity, he or she needs intensity and earnestness to be on the path. So we could think of it as a scalar quantity. But that alone is not going to get him or her far. He needs motive, the right motive. Why is he on the path? What is he trying to learn? As so beautifully stated by both Eugene and Jerry, the ethics of theosophy comes in useful here, and what H.P. Blavatsky calls the motive. So now we have a vector quantity. The compass, the direction is motive, and the intensity and earnestness becomes the scalar. But joined together, they become a vector. However, these two alone is not going to take the neophyte far. You need the light of wisdom, buddhi, as well as be able to operate in all 7 planes. So now it becomes a tensoric quality of multidimensionality. Now, let us start with the apparent contradictory statements with the paragraphs that follow. For example, in the first page, MC states, number 1, as kill out ambition, kill out desire of life, kill out desire of comfort. And then number 4 says, work as those who are ambitious, respect life as those who desire it, be happy as those who live for happiness. So the word ambition doesn't have to be attacked or avoided. It can be transformed so that one is not working for one's own glory. The process of cleansing us requires getting rid of all the base thoughts with ambition. The virya paramita comes in useful here to do all the tasks with energy and is directed to benefit all. It is also saying that one does not have to be a serious person. One can be light-hearted and yet be serious, which Damodar Mavalankar says so beautifully in his article in the 5 Years of Theosophy about contemplation. So one can utilize our lower quaternary adjectives and transform them to help and grow unselfishly. Now, this goes on with words like desire and ambition. And then she also talks about power. Later on page 4, she says, desire power ardently. And then at the bottom, in the explanation, she says, and that power which the disciple shall covet is that which shall make him appear as nothing in the eyes of men. So we see that these words have to be turned on their head, and they are not really contradictory statements that we see here. Now, when we talk about desire, I think of a story from the Puranas. This is a story about Yayati, who was a king in the Chandravarsha dynasty, which is the lunar dynasty. We know that Rama comes from the solar dynasty or the Surya Vamsha dynasty. Now, when we look at Yayati, he was a man who was full of desires, and most of his desires centered around having more women as consorts. His poor wife, Devayani, was distressed, and she goes to her father and pleads with him about her husband's behavior. The father curses Yayati, and he becomes an old man. Now, this does not make him happy. And his son Puru sees that, and he says, Father, let me exchange my youth for your old age. Promptly, the king agrees. So Yayati now has all his lifetime and more to enjoy the pleasures of his desires, his lower desires. The funny thing is, as time passes by, he realizes after a while that there is no end to this. So he goes back to his son after many ages and says, let me get back my old age and you can have your youth. The voice of the silence tells us about this. That is, there is no end to the feelings of desire and lust, and they need to be destroyed completely. Now, the conversation continues with the preparation of the neophyte. And there is a statement made in this section where it says that growth is explained as an unconscious, natural growth like a flower blooming. Now, this is so important for us as students to understand, because the fight with the lower manas is continued while qualifications of the lower manas are being transmuted. So section 2 now, which is also part of the same, talks about awakening the warrior within, that of the higher manas, and in the process, a difficult, thorny, painful process. You start examining others and yourself deeply, delving well to know what cleansing is required. And she talks about the fact that it is easy to look into others' faults and critique them, but it's extremely difficult to look within ourselves and correct what is wrong with us. Then comes the notes from these sections. I shall talk about a few that stand out to me. Talking about ambition in the Light on the Path, she makes a statement that is beautiful in the notes. She says ambition is the first curse. However, she says, it is easy to say, I will not be ambitious. It is not so easy to say, when the master reads my heart, he will find it clean utterly. So that is important to remember. So how do we really work with ambition? Talking about the sense of separateness, which comes on page 16 of the Light on the Path, footnote 2, She says something which goes like this: do not fancy you can stand aside from the bad man or the foolish man. They are yourself, though in a less degree than your friend or your master. And she also adds, she uses the word karma here. But if you allow the idea of separateness from any evil thing or person to grow up within you, by so doing, you create karma, which will bind you to that thing. And then she ends this with something that I find remarkable. Abstain because it is right to abstain, not that you yourself shall be kept clean. You know, when we look at the flower, it grows unconsciously. It doesn't have any vanity. It doesn't have any pride. It isn't even conscious of its beauty. But every time we look at a blooming flower, we think of the beauty and the joy it always gives us. And so all these qualities that we are trying to create within us need to get rid of pride, vanity, selfishness. We now come to the 4 sentences that form the bedrock of the light on the path. And it says, before the eyes can see, they must be incapable of tears. Before the ear can hear, it must have lost its sensitiveness. Before the voice can speak in the presence of the masters, it must have lost the power to wound. Before the soul can stand in the presence of the masters, its feet must be washed in the blood of the heart. So now she spends about 50 or more pages elaborating on these 4 sentences. We see the weaving of the paramitas here once again. She starts out by saying that all this is not easy to comprehend. Just by reading the pages, one needs to read between the words. What she is trying to say is that one needs to develop the power of intuition in us. She also says that it is important to move away from the physical plane and move on to the astral. And she talks about 2 kinds of astral. She talks about the regular astral, the hall of learning, that the voice of the silence talks about. And then she also talks about the divine astral. So she says, one really needs to understand who we really are. She calls it the starry world because it has its own light. Every night when we go to sleep, we go to this starry world, which is called swapna or dream state. And very rarely are we be able to come back to the Jagrat or live awake stage to decode what we see there in the starry world, in the swapna world. We are not even talking about going into Shushupti or Turiya. Even the interpretation of the swapna is hard for us. One of the things MC says is that the light on the path is written in an astral cipher, and these 4 sentences are part of the initiation of the disciple, the neophyte who has entered the hall of learning. She continually has as a background the phrase that all these 4 sentences, probably presented in a different way, are at the entrance of every brotherhood she talks about. And when she talks about brotherhood, she means the initiation region or state for the disciple. She talks about the true meaning of the words, incapable of tears. A cursory glance at that would imply hardness of heart. She says, absolutely not. It is not hardness of heart. It is not what happens as you get old and numb. She says, one must be able to truly suffer and enjoy and it still should not shake him from perceiving his fixed purpose in this life, which comes us back to viraga. Indifference to pain or pleasure, illusion conquered, truth alone perceived. Next, she talks about the hearing. Before the ear can hear, it must have lost its sensitiveness. She says, the usage of the astral senses need to be engraved in the heart of the disciple, which leads, as we already said, to intuitive knowledge. The disciple is eager to get to the masters, but the masters will not be able to hear him till he goes through this trial. And what is this trial? He needs the virya spirit, intuitive knowledge coupled with the will to get to the point closer to the masters. Faith and devotion that is constantly talked about in the Bhagavad Gita needs to be here. In addition, the discipline of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which talk about meditation, needs to be there so that the ears really begin to hear the real sounds needed. Again, echoes from the voice of the silence in the first part.
Oliver. Could we please put our microphones on mute? Thank you. Shobha, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I think everybody heard about the eyes, and now I'm talking about the ears. Before the ear can hear, it must have lost its sensitiveness. Excuse me. And what we find is that just like the voice of the silence says that you need to hear the seven sounds and drown it in the seventh sound, so also here, the ear needs to be hearing the seventh sound. And what is happening meanwhile is that the disciple is caught between two things, double jeopardy for him. There is darkness because his eyes have not really seen the light. Number two, he has to deaden himself to the outside voices. So it's a very difficult and lonely process for the disciple. And he is also transmuting his indriyas, his senses, and he comes with his greatest enemy, which is nobody but himself. So this process of trial, man becomes more than man in the process. One also sees this in the light of Asia when Prince Siddhartha has to face his demons and his temptations. But here is something very interesting that happens, truly interesting. In the process of going within alone, he faces the opposite concept of the unity of all. As he flings ordinary life away from him, it comes back to him in a new form. This may take many incarnations to truly see and hear, but the alertness of all the tensor-like forces in him energize and help him. The next 20 pages deal with the second two sentences about speech and arriving at the master's feet. Before the voice can speak in the presence of the masters, it must have lost the power to wound. Before the soul can stand in the presence of the masters, its feet must be washed in the blood of the heart. Now, we all know that speech is how we communicate, and the disciple is almost ready with all wisdom and humility and to enter the region of the masters with no self-interest present. He keeps in mind what the Dhammapada says. Difficult it is to obtain birth as a human being. Difficult it is to live the life of a man. Difficult it is to get to hear the true law. Difficult it is to attain to enlightenment. Now the disciple is ready to come and talk to the masters to guide him. A pure desire arises in him to ask this question with a complete sense of his inexperience and give him the power to get rid of any selfish motive, and he is ready. Finally, his voice no longer wounds. It's the shaving off of all that he used to think was important and the complete surrender of his personal self and his pride. He cannot wound anyone when he is a part of all of humanity, genuinely. With the final giving up of everything he holds dear, incapable of pain or fear, he can breathe the same air as the master. And MC says that just as tears express the soul of emotion, so blood is the vital creative principle in man's nature. He has let the blood flow and stands naked before the masters. He is devoid of the wish to reincarnate. Incarnate. He wants no heaven and fears no hell. He lives not just in the world, but beyond it. Again, we see echoes of the voice of the silence with the two parts. Liberation, no. Renunciation, yes, he says. Now, before we end this section, I'll say just a few words about karma, because it is very beautiful the way she presents karma here. She talks about it as a little rope mixed with colors because of our actions. And she says that there is no cure for desire, no cure for the love of reward, no cure for the misery of longing, save in the fixing of the sight and the hearing upon that which is invisible and soundless. We already went through that in these 50 pages. As we come to the end of our presentation, I think it is important to look at this maiden with her look of hope, especially today as we face the darkness of lives around us with pain, suffering, and we feel terrified, we feel fearful and teary-eyed. The message in the Light on the Path encourages us to create a counter narrative. Just like Pandora's box got out terrible things and yet had hope finally struggle out, we need to remember that as the eternal pilgrim, we have the potential within us to aim and achieve what the Light on the Path so eloquently delivers. Thank you.